My name is Samuel. I've tried a variety of part-time jobs to earn a few bucks while studying. Like the pizza delivery guy. It was late one summer night, just past midnight, and I had to deliver my last order to a rich neighborhood nearby. When I got there, the house seemed old and there were no lights on inside. I rang the bell attached to the fence pillar a few times, but no one replied. I pushed the gate, it was unlocked, and I walked through the garden up to the porch. I found a note attached to the door. It said, "The door is open, enter, and leave the pizza on the table." I hesitantly made my way inside. The hallway was dark and I couldn't find the light switch, so I used my phone light. There was a table in the middle of the living room and it had some money on it. I put the pizza box down and quickly pocketed the money. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, startling me. I shone the torch towards the entryway, but there was nobody there. I ran a few steps forward and pulled on the door, but it was somehow jammed and I couldn't open it. I called for somebody in the house, but apparently I was alone. In the distance, a phone could be heard ringing from across the room. I picked it up. A man's voice said, "If you don't do what I tell you, you'll be dead soon." "What kind of a joke is this, dude? Let me out," I replied. "Go to the kitchen," he said and hung up. I tried to dial 911, but my phone had no signal. I picked up the other phone, but it was locked. I tried to open the windows, but to my horror, each window had old rusted nails hammered through the frame, keeping them firmly shut. Using my flashlight, I slowly walked through a corridor into the kitchen. That place was a dump. There were no signs of life. On the table, there was a timer and a note read, "That's how long you have left in this world." That scared me, so I began searching for something to use as a weapon, but I found nothing. I opened another door, and I was immediately hit by a terrible smell. It was a bathroom. I bumped into the bathtub, filled to the brim. As I stood, staring in confusion, something bobbed to the surface. That's when I realized the bath was full of what seemed like human bodies. I threw up my guts, covering the floor as I realized that this was not a joke. I noticed a small vent above the bathroom mirror. I clambered on top of the sink and began to shout, hoping to get somebody's attention. I stopped as a beeping sound began from outside. It was the timer in the kitchen. A dragging sound grew louder, and the door eased open with a creak, and I saw a man standing in the dark, an axe in hand. He smiled as he said, "Your time is over." The man was huge. I knew I had no chance of overpowering him. I spun around and backed off into another room. I ended up in a cluttered room full of things, and I began throwing anything at him, all that I could possibly reach. I got him right in the head with a lamp. He closed his eyes and stopped for a moment. He then smiled and kept coming forward. He eventually cornered me, inhaled deeply, and raised his axe. Without thinking, I took a piece of the broken lamp and slashed it across his cheek. As he recoiled, I slipped under his arms and rushed to the hallway. The door was unlocked now, so I got out and ran to my bike. I sped off as fast as I could without so much as looking back for fear of seeing him still chasing me. When the police arrived, the man was gone. Turns out, that house had been closed off to the public for the past 20 years, and someone was using it to lure people and use them for their own entertainment. Thank God I got out of that place. Right before he could slice me like a piece of pizza.
That day, I was going to an interview straight out of college. That was a big opportunity for me, and running late was not what I would have needed. Typical. Just as I rounded the corner, I watched as the bus pulled away from the stop further up the street. As I pulled out my phone to call a cab, I dropped all the documents I needed for the interview straight into a puddle at my feet. A hand came from nowhere and began picking everything up. It was a young guy who handed me the documents and said, "There you go, beautiful." I smiled at him, then ran away towards the taxi rank. The rest of the day sort of fell into place. I did the interview, then headed home. That night, I needed to relax, so I called a few friends and headed into town for a drink. The night was going well. At one point, I headed to the bathroom to sort my hair and check my makeup. When I returned, there was a note under my drink. "Hi, beautiful. Great to see you." My friend swore she hadn't seen who left the message on the table. I looked around the bar trying to figure out who had left that note, but nobody stood out to me. But then I realized I knew it had to be that guy. The word beautiful bounced around my head. That night, it was 4 a.m. when my phone rang, shocking me out of a daze. The caller ID said unknown. "Hi, beautiful. Relaxing after a long day? I'll see you in the morning." And with that, he put the phone down. Who is this guy? I don't even remember his face. And how did he get my number? But then it hit me. On the coffee table lay the water-damaged documents for the interview. On the top page, all my contact details written for all to see. Over the next few weeks, every night, after work, I got the same phone calls, and the occasional note left on my door. "Hi, beautiful. Look amazing today. Hi, beautiful. We belong together. Hi, beautiful. You'll be mine soon. Can't wait." I decided to ask my friend to sleep over at my place. I didn't know what to expect from that weirdo, and all the calls and messages seemed to stop the day she slept over. A few weeks later, I just finished my final shift at work before breaking up for summer, then headed towards the train station just after 11 p.m. The streets were quiet and peaceful. After a few minutes, I noticed a subtle noise coming from behind me and spotted a man following me at a distance. With his hood up, I couldn't make out who it was, but I was positive it was my stalker. His pace began to speed up until it sounded as though he was right on top of me. I waved at the passing car, trying to get their attention, but they just waved back as the car sailed by. A quick tug on my arm pulled me backwards, spinning me around. He was coming closer, mumbling something. Before I could react, a second guy appeared from the shadow, launching a few blows to the assailant's head, sending him to the floor. I was in tears, and I began to thank the man for helping when he turned to me and said, "Hi, beautiful. Lucky I was around." After that, it all went hazy. When I awoke, the assailant was stood above me with an officer. Turns out my stalker had done this before, and they were watching me and him, and the hooded guy following me was there for my protection. After searching his apartment, they found many girls' belongings and a bed with handcuffs and straps, seemingly in anticipation for his next victim, me. I don't like driving that much. But a few years ago, I had to drive like 2 hours a day to attend a business specialization course. One day, I got stuck in traffic, and it took me an hour just to get past a roadblock because a bus went off the road and the tow truck couldn't pull it out from the mud. I finally got through, and after a few miles, I saw a pregnant woman standing at the bus stop hitchhiking. I felt sorry for her, so I stopped to offer her a ride. She quickly opened the door and got in the car. I told her that the bus was off-road, so she would have waited forever in vain. She thanked me and told me she only needed to go a few miles ahead. She started talking about the weather and stuff like that. After a while driving, 2 police cars with the siren on passed us, and the lady became visibly agitated. All the while, she kept a hand in her purse, where I caught a glimpse of a shiny blade. I was sure by then that something bad was about to happen. Then I noticed something strange about her hair. She was wearing a strange wig. I looked at it closely and clearly saw a badly shaved chest hair in her cleavage. She took the knife again, and I knew she was going to attack me. I immediately realized that I wasn't speaking to a hitchhiker, but to a criminal with bad intentions. That freaked me out, but I managed to keep calm. I didn't know what to do, so I just pulled over. She asked me why I was stopping. I said I was going to be sick and I needed to stop for a moment, and I got out of the car. She let me go because I left the engine on, I guess. The hitchhiker quickly moved to the driving seat and floored it. But the engine stopped because I had the anti-theft plate on me. She got out of the car and told me to come back while I was walking away, pointing the other direction. Then she starts walking towards me. I started running, and she booked it, losing his wig, and she started shouting something I couldn't hear. She was furious. After a few seconds, I was out of breath when finally a car stopped by. I begged the driver to help me because someone was chasing me, but the hitchhiker was gone. The man who stopped by brought me to my car and waited for me to get in safely. I left straight away and I called the police. The police caught the hitchhiker later that day, a dangerous fugitive on the loose that had committed countless crimes. I could have been his next victim that day. But I have learned the lesson. I will never pick up another hitchhiker again.
My name is Leonard. This happened 2 years ago while I was camping with my two best friends, Carlos and Gabriel. That weekend, we decided to explore the new camping spot in the forest we had learned about online. When we arrived, Carlos decided to put up the tent since he was the fastest, while Gabriel and I searched the forest floor for firewood. We went to go search for anything interesting down by the nearby lake. There, we spotted a man sitting on a log. When he glanced up at us, he stood up and began fidgeting with his rod, appearing to be completely inexperienced, almost as though he was just mimicking as best he could. "So what kind of fish do you catch in these waters anyways?" I asked, trying to make casual small talk. "You know, just the usual kind, I guess," he said with beads of sweat dripping down his forehead. I then realized that he was fly fishing, but he wasn't casting the rod at all. And he was just wearing normal clothes, no boots. He didn't look like a typical fisherman. I pointed it out to my friends and we all laughed, but the man heard us and he turned to me with a nervous look in his eyes. Anyway, I began to walk around the lake, hunting for mushrooms in the trees nearby. After a while, I came across a plaid shirt slightly hidden behind a couple of trees. Upon closer inspection, however, I noticed drag marks leading from the water and into the trees. I soon realized it was the upper torso of what appeared to be a dead man. I screamed as I ran to my friends, frantically telling them what I saw, and they stared at me in shock, pointing to the fisherman standing just a few feet away. He said, "Now you've seen too much." His smile was cold and disturbed. The gun and a bloody knife attached to his belt were made visible. We took off at full speed and dashed into the forest while the man started screaming at us, and bang, a shot flew through the air. The sound was deafening. He was shooting at us. A bullet grazed me across the leg and I fell down behind my friends. They ran over and managed to pick me up while the crazed man was closing in. Carlos threw a big rock at the guy, hitting him square in the chest and causing him to drop the gun. We hid in the bushes and the man passed right beside us, screaming and walking frantically. When he was far enough, we went in the opposite direction, hiding from bush to bush until we made it back to our camp and Carlos slipped into his tent. I told him that we had to get the hell out of there and leave everything behind. He showed me the car keys in his hand and we ran to the parking lot as fast as we could, only I was limping now. We got into our car and I quickly started to unlock a cumbersome but efficient anti-theft mechanism. That was when the killer jumped right on the windscreen with a crazy smile. We all froze. He pointed the gun at me and pulled the trigger. but the gun didn't fire. He either ran out of bullets or the gun jammed, so without much afterthought, he hit the windscreen with the butt of his gun. I started to breathe again and managed to unlock the car. We sped off with the man still clinging onto the hood. I slammed on the brakes and made him fly away. I drove off in shock and disbelief for what had just happened to us. We went to the hospital and contacted the police. The guy was never caught, but how many more murderers could still be out there in those beautiful woods?
I liked all my teachers back in high school. Almost all of them. There was this math teacher who was incredibly boring. We fell asleep like 5 minutes after his lesson started, and we couldn't wait for his lesson to end. One day, it was a Tuesday morning and we had a math lesson. But when the door opened, a stranger came in the class. He said his name was Brooks, and he would be a substitute for the math teacher for a few weeks. He began writing some equations on the blackboard we had already learned the year before. I pointed that out, and he got very angry and told me to shut up, giving us a serious look. It was more like a warning not to mess with him. But he also looked funny with his old plaid suit and his nervous tics, and when he put the chalk and the eraser in his pockets, we all laughed. He banged his fists on the desk and turned purple with rage. Then he stared at me as though I was the only one laughing. That wasn't a good start indeed, and every time he talked to the class, he kept glaring at me. A few days later, I was practicing in the chemistry lab before the weekend break. That evening, I had to go to a party with my classmate Nicole, who left with the other students when the bell rang. I stayed a little longer because I had to take some notes from my locker that I needed for the next week's lesson, and I decided to sort out the mess in there. Then I closed the locker and I saw Mr. Brooks standing behind the closet door. I said hello to him and tried to leave, but he stepped in front of me, grinning. I moved aside and tried to pass him, but he moved to block the way again and again. I shook my head, questioning him, and he just kept staring at me. Then I took my cell phone out to call my friend, but he grabbed my arm and made me drop everything on the floor. I spun around and ran back to the chemistry lab while he was shouting, "Who's laughing now?" I cried for help, but there was nobody left in the school that late, and Brooks knew it. I ran around the tables back and forth while he chased me frantically. He began to throw stuff on the floor, trying to block me, and I eventually found myself up against the wall. He grabbed my arms tight with crazy eyes and said, "Now I'm gonna teach you some manners." But right at that moment, my friend and 2 security guards walked in the door. As Mr. Brooks saw them, he composed himself, pretending nothing happened. But a guard yelled at him to get away from me and asked him to follow them. My friend told me that after she answered my phone call, she heard me screaming and realized I was in danger. The teacher had already been kicked out from 2 private schools in the past for mistreating students, but he didn't get charged due to a lack of evidence. But this time there were witnesses. That's why Mr. Brooks will never teach in another school ever again. This happened to me years ago, while driving along the I-80 back to Denver after visiting my parents in Iowa. It was 1 a.m. when it started raining, and I realized that I was almost out of gas. I had lost hope when I saw a sign for a gas station 5 miles ahead. But when I got there, I saw a creepy and dark place with car carcasses and rubbish everywhere. One of those old family-owned gas stations. I was scared, but I had no choice at that point. As I stopped, an old man came out running through the rain. I asked him to fill the tank, gave him my credit card, and I went to the restroom. I then go out and run towards the car, but the old man shouted at me to go back inside because my card had been denied. When I entered his office, the man walked towards me and gave me my card. He then grabbed my arm and put his head close to my ear and said, "I have to tell you something." I slapped him and I shouted, "Let me go! Get away from me!" And I ran out while the man was shouting at me to wait. I get in my car and I drive off, while the man is screaming and flailing his arms at me. I wasn't mad. I felt relieved because I was back on the road again. I turned on the radio and started to relax. When suddenly, I felt a spike on my side and I heard a voice that said, "Now, if you do what I tell you, nothing bad will happen to you." I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a man with a disfigured face in my back seat. I may seem tough, but I'm afraid of my own shadow. I couldn't speak and I felt paralyzed. Literally. I couldn't move my arms and the car started to skid. I then tried to countersteer. I tried to brake, but with a wet and slippery road, I ended up against an electric utility pole. I passed out. When I opened my eyes, there were highway patrol officers and medical personnel taking care of me. The man in the back seat was gone. I told the police about the disfigured man and I realized at that moment that the old man at the gas station was trying to warn me. My car was destroyed that night, but I considered myself lucky. I couldn't imagine what could have happened to me if it had gone differently.
It's been a while now since I've become a major shut-in 88% of the time. While my best friend Gerda was always the one that came up with all the new ideas to have fun. 4 months ago, she was invited to a party that was going to be thrown on Wednesday at 11 p.m. by some guy she just met. I brought up how weird it was to have a party midweek, but when the day came, Gerda showed up at my place and convinced me to go. We drove for a half mile outside of town, to a house in a fairly spread out neighborhood. We walked onto the porch and a friendly-faced girl laughed and opened the door to let us inside. It was fairly dark inside and a small gathering of about a dozen people were already downstairs, dancing, drinking, and enjoying themselves. We were eager for free booze and some serious fun. We drank and danced around like the nerds we are with one another for about a half hour or so, when suddenly the music switched over to what seemed to be the blaring sound of TV static. A sudden bright white flash startled and caught me off guard, blinding me for a few seconds. I felt myself dragged into the next room and pulled down to the floor. Multiple hands forced my arms backwards, keeping me still, and what I'm guessing was one person could tightly bind my hands behind me. My eyes flung open with the most sickening fear as I scanned the room and noticed the dozens of burning candles littered around the place and the large vine-looking circle we were forced to kneel inside of. I looked behind me and noticed Gerda in the same position. Along the ceiling, the words, "Malum Venio," were scrawled in red. Tears flowed from Gerda's eyes and I knew she felt the weight of guilting me to come here. There were only 2 people in sight at this point to keep watch over us, wearing a long dark green and black robe with a blood-red hood. One of them opened his tunic, showing off his chest full of scars, before pulling out a big machete with something written on it, while the other man had some kind of rudimental iron tongs in his hands. The man raised the machete over his head, mumbling something, while the other indicated the other room, motioned to wait, and ran off. Another stranger comes downstairs and tells the scarred man something before glancing over at us and running back upstairs. Then the man with the machete heads into the kitchen and begins fiddling with the music system. As he does this, Gerda scoots and positions herself behind me, managing to quickly undo my restraints with a piece of broken bottle she found on the floor. Once freed, I tried cutting her out of her restraints as well, but my hands were shaky and weak. I heard the music once again and I realized that the man would be back soon. The second Gerda's hands were freed, I sprinted for the now closed door, fumbling with the 3-lock system before hearing a stomach-churning shriek from one of the cultists, and finally I wrenched the door open and we sprinted outside. We were so terrified that we just ran straight down the main road that led back into town, hearing the distant sounds of revving engines beginning to draw closer. Gerda yelled to me with panic in her voice to keep going and to get help as fast as I could, while she was running across a small field that led into a bit of forest. I ran on the sheer willpower and my need to survive and the want to desperately make sure these people were caught, and I did get help. It took a few hours for the police to find Gerda in those woods in the thick of the night, but other than a serious mess and Gerda's trashed car, the police found nothing helpful, and not even one of those cultists were ever found. To this day, I shiver thinking of what could have happened to us in that house. Who knows? One thing for sure, though, I will never go to a stranger's party again.
I used to live in a pretty nice neighborhood. I had a lot of friends and I was happy, but everything was about to change. That day, I was at home with my parents. My father was fixing some shelves while my mother was cooking her special Italian lasagna. Richard, our new neighbor, who had just moved into the house opposite to ours, came over to introduce himself. He was a friendly and talkative person in his 50s. He said that he was working on some kind of insurance business and seemed like a really good man. When he left, he greeted us, waving his hand with a big smile, but I noticed something kind of strange in his eyes. Anyways, during the following days, I saw him on the street again and again. At first, I thought that it could have just been a series of coincidences. He is my neighbor after all. But then I started seeing him everywhere. And I kind of felt like he was following me, and as soon as he spotted my parents, he'd disappear. Then, one day, he kept asking about my social media accounts and then asked me if he could take a picture of me. I said no, and I walked away, but he took some pictures of me with his cell phone anyway. I was confused, and I really didn't understand. Why was that dude following me? And what did he want from me? That evening, I took my dad's telescope and I tried to look over to Richard's house to see what he was up to. What I saw shocked me. He was looking at my photos and he had the entire wall full of pictures of little girls. That man wasn't just a weirdo. He was a sick person obsessed with little children. The next night, I heard some noise and I saw him rummaging in our trash can. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw him take my used tampon. That was just too much. I decided that the next day I had to tell my parents about him and get them to call the police. I tried to fall asleep. But the next day, I was awakened by the sound of police and people shouting. So I ran into the kitchen and I found the police arresting my parents. I screamed and I ran towards them, but the neighbor stopped me and said, "Wait, I'm sorry, but those people are not your real parents. These people kidnapped you when you were 3 years old. You have been missing for 14 years, and we finally found you." The DNA test confirmed everything. It was the beginning of the summer sales, and I spent all day looking for bargains and something nice to buy. I hadn't done it for a long while, and buying something for me made me feel better. But I had this strange feeling, like I was being watched. That evening, I had to take the train to get home, while my friend lived just a few blocks away from the shopping area. My friend walked me to the station and I gave her my shopping bags because I had to use the restroom. After being out all day on the street, I really needed to go, and so I had no choice at that point but to use the public restroom. It seemed clean at least, and large with many stalls. I chose a stall, I closed the door, and I sat down. Then I saw a shadow moving outside and I heard a strange noise. something like a mouth snapping. And as always in public restrooms, the lock on the door was broken. Then suddenly, a figure seemed to be getting close to my door. And I saw a man trying to look in the space between the door and the stall. I immediately shouted, "Go away, you pervert!" He moved away, but he came back and grabbed my bag hanging from my knee. I held on to the bag as hard as I could, but the shoulder strap broke and he pulled the bag away. I got out quickly and ran after him. I saw him hiding behind the last two stalls, but when he saw me, he pulled out a knife and started walking towards me. I moved quickly and rushed to the exit, but the door was locked. Luckily, it had a twist lock and I could turn it, and I did. I ran, screaming as fast and as loud as I could to get someone's attention. My friend heard me screaming and ran up to me. I told her that I had my bag stolen with all my money, credit cards, and cell phone with tons of pictures inside. The police arrived quickly and searched the area, the maintenance stores, everywhere, but the thief was long gone. The agents kindly walked me to the platform to make sure I took the train safely. When the train started moving, I immediately felt safe, and I leaned out of the window to say hello to my friend by waving my hand. Since then, I never went to a public restroom alone.
I used to be a bookworm back in college, and I didn't go out that much. That's why a friend of mine signed me up to a dating website, even though I never liked the idea because you never know who you're gonna meet. When I signed in, I received dozens of messages in just a few minutes, but all the guys who'd shown interest in me were either too old or too creepy. However, there was one guy that caught my eye, so I replied to his messages. We talked for the next few weeks, and then he asked me out. He sounded interesting, and I agreed to meet him in a bar downtown. He seemed like a nice guy, but he was trying too hard to sound funny, and he never stopped talking. Anyway, I just wasn't into him, and 10 minutes later, I was already thinking of ways to leave early. The bartender noticed me, and he could tell I was bored. While my date was in the restroom, the bartender approached me and asked me if I was okay. I told him that I was on my first date, and I wasn't having much fun. He asked me if I wanted to leave with him, since his shift was almost over, so he could free me from this awkward date. I was tempted to say yes, but my date returned from the restroom. I gave a subtle headshake no to the guy, and I smiled. When my date sat back down at the table, he was noticeably agitated, and he started talking even faster. I was pretty sure that he took something while he was in the restroom. He then grabbed my arm and pulled me and tried to kiss me. I pushed him away. I grabbed my handbag and I stood up. The bartender quickly took my hand and pulled me away. I followed him behind the bar and we fled out the back door. We left and he said he was my savior and told me that I owed him one. But when he pointed to his car, my mood changed. And I told him that I didn't even know his name. He smiled, said his name was John, and told me that if I didn't go with him, he would immediately call back the guy from the bar. I smiled and I followed him to his car. When we got there, we found two guys leaning on his car, and John started shouting at them to move away. One of the guys started approaching us, telling John to calm down, but he charged at them and started throwing punches out of nowhere. What the hell, I thought. What a shitty night. From bad to worse. I walked away while John was waving his arms, shouting at me to get back to him. I got out from another exit and I called a taxi that brought me home. The next day, as I was watching the evening news, I saw a story of a poor girl who had been beaten and killed in a parking lot behind the bar. The very bar that I was at the night before. They showed the picture of the perpetrator. And it was John, the bartender.
When I was in my first year of college, I took a house-sitting job from my mom's best friend while he was on a monthly cruise. It was a kind of emergency because the girl who was house-sitting the place left the day before without notice. I saw it as a way to earn a few bucks, so I didn't mind spending a few nights in a large house with plenty of food, PlayStation, and cable TV. At sunset, I checked all the doors and windows, set the alarm, and called the landlord to assure him that everything was fine. Later that night, I was watching a movie when I heard a weird sound coming from the garden. I didn't care much because that house was like a fortress. I heard it again, so I paused the movie and went to check. But all I found was a bunch of cats fighting on the porch. When I went back to the living room, I saw the door that led upstairs had been opened. I had left that door closed, I was sure. I didn't want to trash the rest of the house only to have to clean it later. Then I heard that strange noise again, but now it was coming from inside the house. That scared me, so I started looking for my phone only to remember I had left it in the other room. Then I felt a presence behind me. I turned around quickly and saw a man holding a rope walking towards me. Jumping in fear, I dropped my phone. I grabbed a pot from the table and I smashed it over the man's head. That gave me a few seconds, so I managed to run away into the next room and close the door behind me. The man quickly came around and started yelling and banging on the door. I shouted, "What do you want? Leave me alone!" He stopped and then said, "I'll be back for you." I could hear my breath deeper and deeper, but then I realized that wasn't me I was hearing. I turned around and saw a girl tied to the radiator. I got closer. She opened her eyes slightly and tried to say something. We looked at each other for a few moments in silence. The banging started again, this time much louder than before. He was using something heavy. The iron window was shut electronically, but it was too small to get through anyway. I looked around, found a lighter, and I started to burn a piece of paper. I put the flame close to the smoke detector. The fire alarm went off. The banging stopped. After a few minutes, the firefighters arrived, and so did the police, medical assistants, and even local TV. The girl was in shock and didn't say a word. She had been tied up in that room for 3 days. That man had been using the girl's phone to text her family and keep them quiet. But people started calling, so he had staged an unexpected and urgent journey the girl needed to take. They never caught that man to this day, and I haven't been much help identifying him either. That night, a large crowd gathered outside of the house. Who knows if between those people